Morning. Good morning. My name is Kurt Owens. Welcome. I am president of the Milwaukee Declaration, and we're coming together on another conversation regarding race. And so we have some of the pastors here joining us from the Milwaukee Declaration. We have Pastor Matt Erickson of Eastbrook Church, who's joining us this morning. We have Pastor Jay English from Parkland Assembly of God. We have Pastor Peter Borg from Citybrook Church, and we have Pastor Beverly Rayfield from World Impact Ministries. And we have a gentleman that's joining us, Willie Lee. He is a former police officer and serviceman for the United States Armed Forces, be joining us this morning. So it'd be interesting to hear his perspective as well this morning. I'm going to pass it off to Pastor Matt if he could just share a little bit about the Milwaukee Declaration, how we got started, and some of what we stand for.
Thanks, Kurt. Good morning, everybody. Just want to welcome you to this third Pastors Forum on Race in America, hosted by the Milwaukee Declaration. The Milwaukee Declaration is a group of pastors and churches who've come together to stand together across racial lines to be part of the work of the gospel and the work of racial reconstruction. And so we have taken opportunity at this time to just try to speak and also bring conversations together. And it started about in 2014 with some of the difficulties here at Red Arrow Parkway and the shooting of Dontre Hamilton, and pastors coming together to say, hey, we want to be part of the solution. We want to learn how to talk about these things and be part of the change in our city. We've been engaged with numerous things over the last several years. And at this key moment, we just want to continue that conversation, but not just conversation, action together. And so thanks for participating, everybody, in this opportunity to hear, to listen, to learn, and to grow together. Kurt, back over to you.
Thanks, Matt. And again, we use the term racial reconstruction as opposed to racial reconciliation. And one of the things that I always like to point out is the reason why we do that is because there's really never been a time in the history of America where there has been zero tension between the Black and white community. There's always been a bit of a divide there. Certainly, there's been some decent relationships, but just the overall dynamic. And so we use the term racial reconstruction because essentially the easiest definition for that, it's the reimagination of the other. And so if you've had a bad experience with someone of the other race, and that might have formed your imagination of the other. So until you have an opportunity to have your mind reconstructed in regards to race, we kind of stand at this divide. And so we just hope to kind of lead that discussion. And so we're going to begin today asking the first question, and I'm going to pose that to you, Jay. The first question is how can the gospel nullify the deflectivists during times of racial tension? And one of the examples when we talk about a deflectivist is, someone that's actually taking away from the issue at hand and replacing it with its own issue. For instance, we've been hearing, we should be using this time to bring more attention to fallen officers as opposed to the brutality that we see that's going on in our community. So again, the question to you is, how can we nullify the deflectivists during through the gospel during times of racial tension?
I think that's a crazy question, but I think it's it's real from the standpoint. I think we first have to acknowledge, are we dealing with Christians? Number one, me coming at you with the gospel around this idea and this topic, if you don't really believe the Bible, if you're not really interested in digging into what the scripture says, then that's already null and void. But from a biblical perspective, there is so much scripture. There's so many mentions of the word and the terminology around oppression, about relieving those who are under oppression. There's so many things, even in Isaiah, chapter 1 talks about doing justice. Chapter 58 teaches us on the realities of your city can shine like a bright light, if you're doing these things for people who have less than, or who are being mistreated in a lot of ways. Jesus even fussed at the Pharisees, and he had, the times when I saw Jesus do what I would feel un-Jesus-like behavior was a lot of time when he was talking to religious people. calling them hypocrites, calling them, liars. And he looked at the Pharisees and said, hey, you're doing all these incredible things, but you're missing the more important aspects of mercy and justice. So I think when people are deflecting and they're wanting to look at specifically police officers, I look at a police officer and say, because you are a carrier and a bearer of the law, you should be held to a higher standard. And I think there's even biblical aspect of that. I think it's Matthew chapter 5, where, it's like those of us who are teachers, we're going to be held to a higher standard. It's just kind of a reality of it. If you are carrying the badge and you are carrying the gun, I believe you definitely have a responsibility for carrying out justice in a particular way. And also, if you misuse that authority, I really believe you should be held to a much higher standard than maybe someone like me or someone else who might be watching this show who has not had that training, who has not had that type of responsibility.
Thanks for sharing, Jay. I'm going to punt it over to you, Pastor Beverly. If you can answer that same question, how can the gospel nullify the deflectivists during times of racial tension?
There's a passage of scripture that has been very much at the forefront with my husband and I, and with some of the leaders in our congregation. Micah 6:8, that, he has told you, mankind, what is good. What does the Lord require from you except to carry out justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God? And, the word says to do justice and love mercy. And I think a lot of people don't realize that part of justice is mercy. Justice is not just carrying out punishment. These two go hand in hand. And for some reason, people, even in the church, find satisfaction, great satisfaction, when there's justice. It's just one-sided a lot of times, even in the lives of believers. And until we connect mercy with that justice, our mindset is not going to change. And I think even the justice of God, it looks very different than what we have viewed it in our own upbringing and in our own the churches that we've grown up in, and the mindsets that we've grown up with, that have formed and shaped our opinions and the way that we view how justice is met out. I just think that there is an absolute confrontation coming to the church of what that word justice really means. And the word justice, as defined in the Word of God, is very different than what I'm seeing coming from a lot of believers right now. And you cannot disconnect justice from mercy ever in any way, shape, or form. And somehow we've done that, and we need to get back to that place of understanding what true justice is. I'm going to give a little, with the deflecting. I get that a lot in my conversations with people. I have these conversations over and over again, and the way that I have been sharing it is, you can have 10 things in front of you. And this was taught to me by a very great biblical teacher on what equity looks like and what balance looks like. And they said, you can have 10 things in front of you that, let's put 10 boxes in front of you, and you have these 10 areas that need attention, and putting 10% in each box. They said, that's not really equity. Even it's not making sure that everything gets 10% of your attention. They said at any given time, there's going to be one or two of those items that you need to pull to the forefront because this needs the greatest amount of attention. And so I've learned that equity, and when people are deflecting, it's because, this is just as important as that. And you know what? That may be correct. We do need these other, it doesn't nullify these other areas, but right now, this is what needs our attention. This is what demands our attention. This is where the injury is that we need to cut, because when this gets tended to, I believe that other things are going to fall into place. But we can't deflect anymore away from what is right smack dab in front of us. And I don't believe that change is going to come in these other areas until this one is tended to.
Thank you, Beverly, for sharing. I'm going to punt it over to you, Pastor Matt. If you can answer the same question, how can the gospel nullify the deflectivists during racial tension?
I mean, I think some of that conversation, you know, we're at a place in our nation where we do not know how to talk to each other, and so we're doing a lot of talking past each other. And one of my greatest concerns in the church is that we learn how to talk to each other again. And if I was in a conversation with my wife and she was bringing up a source of pain and I just kept deflecting it this way or that way, I'm going to tell you that's not going to go over well because I'm not engaging with what's really going on. And so in the conversations where we have about the racial injustice and someone begins to deflect, you know, kind of like, what about this? What about that? Many times it's just a way to avoid facing into things that are uncomfortable and helping people to enter into uncomfortable places. That's what we see Jesus doing all the time. We see him as engaging with real issues of justice. You know, it says in Luke chapter 4, when he is starting his public ministry, he quotes Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring, you know, good news. We kind of stop there, but when you read the whole thing in Isaiah 61, it's about breaking the cords of injustice. It's about recovery of sight for the blind. I have some, you know, like in my charismatic background, a lot of that was like signs and wonders, but it also relates to the real fasting that God requires in Isaiah 58 is for justice to come into the public sphere. And so to encourage people to maybe name what is uncomfortable for them and why they're deflecting it, I think you have to figure out, is this somebody who really wants to engage and have a conversation? If so, praise God, let's step forward in that. If it's somebody who's just trying to throw something up so they don't really have to engage, I just probably don't spend a lot of time with that. I think then it really calls us to move into another place of deeper engagement. But I don't know. I think Jesus invites us to go into uncomfortable places, and a lot of the deflecting is really a chance to an attempt to avoid some of that instead of enter into and carrying the brother's burden in the middle of this moment that's just so painful and important.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate your perspective on that. And just even for myself, I think one of the first things that I think about is the great command. You know, that we're called to love God with all our heart, mind, and our soul. And you know, he says the second is to love our neighbor as ourselves, which is one of the things I mean that we're big proponents of at the declaration. But if that's the case, and my neighbor has a complaint, you know, for me to go ahead and disregard my neighbor's complaint and come up with a whole nother issue, I think is just the wrong thing to do. And for me, it's like if you say it, and instead of us bringing attention to police brutality, we should bring attention to fallen police officers. I would say, then why aren't you leading the charge on fallen police officers? I'll support you, but don't take the time when we're talking about police brutality to say, hey, what about this? And I'm like, well, why don't you lead that charge? And I'll support you. It seems like when I hear the deflection, it's just like the only time that people are bringing up these issues is when another issue comes up. And so I just think as the body of Christ that we should not find ourselves deflecting one issue to raise up another. And then certainly I think it's probably a worthy cause on both ends. There are people that have lost their lives, you know, in the line of duty, and it's not a disrespect to them that have, but at the same time, we don't take that the moment away from those that have lost their lives at the hands of police brutality to say, what about this? I think all of it matters. It's just, again, if my neighbor has a complaint, my neighbor is going through, then I think as the body of Christ that we have a responsibility, one, to acknowledge that. And immediately we hear people, instead of even acknowledging the pain, we just immediately start talking about, well, what about this? And that's just certainly not the power of the gospel. We know a power of the gospel that actually has concerns for all people. There's no favoritism in it. And so while we're speaking about that, I would love, Willie, if I could just as a as a former police officer, would love to just kind of hear your perspective of that when you hear people deflecting during times of police brutality.
Go ahead, Willie.
Okay, we say here. Okay, I'm sorry.
I think you got a little feedback there, Willie. Maybe I'll come back to you.
How about now? Is that better?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Now, run that by me again. What was your question again? I've been hearing the discussion, but just run your question by me again on what.
The question was is you know, how can the gospel nullify the deflectiveness during the times of racial tension? And one of the things that we've kind of been discussing is when we start talking about police brutality, immediately we'll hear people deflect that issue and start talking about, well, what about the fallen officers? Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. You know, having been an officer and seeing officers fall, you know, while I was on the job, I don't know why there's a deflection or why they associate a fallen officer with police brutality. Because for me, one has nothing to do with the other. You know, there are people who say officers take this job to, you know, go through public abuse or even losing their lives, and that's not the case. That's not why officers become officers. At least that's not why I did. No one becomes an officer to sacrifice their life. It happens, but that's not why. No one that I know of personally became an officer to brutalize anyone. And I don't understand personally why that even happens, but it does. And I know without a doubt, and there'll be those who would dispute it, but this is my opinion. There are those who brutalize people because of the color of their skin, because of hatred. I know that. Uh, so when people say, when you have cases like that's going on right now with police brutality, and that's what the protesting is about, and I stand with them on protesting against it, there is a deflection, like with Black Lives Matter. So how many times did you hear all lives matter before Black Lives Matter? How many times did you hear blue lives matter before all Black lives matter? You didn't. It becomes a deflection from what they're saying. They're classifying them as terrorists and all that, and that's not the case. These are the voices of people who are saying, stop taking Black lives. You know, do something to stop the police from taking Black lives. So I think we just have to speak. We have to speak out against it, regardless of who we are, if we're part of the gospel or not. We have to speak out against police brutality. There's no doubt about it. Either you speak out or you remain silent and let it continue. Let it continue. Just a little bit off of that. There's a actor that I held so much respect for until I heard him give his perspective on how to rid this country of racism. And he said, stop talking about it. I do not agree with that. That's why we're where we are, because nobody wanted to talk about it. It's still an uncomfortable subject to talk about, but we have to talk about it. So when you talk about police brutality and people deflecting from it, they have a right to their opinion, but we have to speak. We have to speak. I think that's one way we're going to curb this. So
All
that's
right.
just a little bit of what I think about it.
All right, thanks for sharing, Willie. I also want to throw out there, we're going to be taking questions from some of our listeners, so feel free to start shooting your questions in as well, and we'll be sure to get to some of the questions as they come in. I do want to throw a question out to Pastor Peter. I'm going to throw a question out to you. That question is, prior to any of the controversy surrounding this issue, what was your initial thoughts regarding the slogan, "Make America Great Again"?
I laughed because I don't know under what, if our founding document says all men are created equal, and that is therefore the measuring stick by which we're going to assess our greatness or lack thereof. As a historian, in addition to pastoring, There has never, ever been a time in this country, not since 1776, not since, the early 1600s when Europeans first arrived here, that there has been any semblance of America being great in terms of its ability to live in a society where all men are treated equally because they're all created equally by a loving God. And so it's a silly statement, and it is not a true statement. If you wanted to look at it, as I'm sure certain people do, as this was a country built by white people for white people, then maybe the slogan,
Peter, I think we're having a little
works
couple
a
of
little
issues.
bit, but still there. So it's just, hello.
Yeah, we're having some issues with your audio, Peter. So we'll work on that a little bit.
Okay.
In the interim, let me pose that same question to Pastor Matt. Prior to any of the controversy coming around this slogan, what was your initial thoughts? And it's important that I ask a question prior to the controversy because I really do want your initial thoughts to when you first heard that, and just so our listeners to just really get a real raw understanding of what everybody thought when they first heard it before the controversy arrived. So I'm going to punt that question over to you, Pastor Matt.
I want to say thanks, Kurt, but I'm not sure if I should say thanks or not. I mean, the question for me, really, I'm a kind of a natural skeptic about political messaging, right? So every time I hear, no matter where people are coming from, and I'm a committed independent, so I'm just going to be straightforward about that. I'm asking, what are they trying to say? What is the statement behind the statement? And what is greatness in that statement? So this is before even some of the controversy. I'm like, what does great mean? And what does America mean? And who are we talking about? And who is this for? And so for me, knowing it's a political message right out of the gate, I think I just come with a lot of questions, trying to understand that. And then obviously, as it became sort of representative of other things, have an aversion to it, because I think it doesn't necessarily mean for everybody anyway. So I think trying to get to the meaning behind things is pretty important to me. So trying to understand what that was significance, I came with a lot of skepticism to that statement. I mean, at kind of a basic level, I can understand what Peter was saying at the end of a statement. For some people, that means certain positive things. But I think it's really asking for who, what does greatness mean, by what measure, in what categories, and who's America kind of are we talking about here? So for me, it's just a lot of questions.
Thanks for that, Pastor Matt. Pastor Jay, I'm going to punt it over to you. What was your initial thoughts before any controversy came, for anybody said anything about it? When you first seen it, what was your initial thoughts when you saw the slogan, "Make America Great Again"?
I did the same thing Pete did. I laughed. I said, who make it again? Where are we going back to? I'm trying to figure out when it was great for us. If I'm being honest, like, this is the best it's been for us in history, and we're still here right now dealing with what we're dealing with. So what are we going back to? Are we going back to redlining? Are we going back to African Americans cannot purchase housing in certain suburbs, which is why even now in Milwaukee, there's a large concentration of us in the middle, and all of the surrounding suburbs are mostly Caucasian. Those laws were on the books for a long time. Are we going back to riding on the back of the bus? Are we going back to segregation? Are we going back to slavery? Are we going back to lynchings? But unfortunately, lynchings are still happening. So I'm trying to figure out what we're going back to that was great. When I heard that statement, I was really confused. So yeah, I laughed and I said, he is not talking to people like me. He's talking to somebody else.
Thanks for sharing, Jay. Thanks for sharing, and appreciate your honesty. And Pastor Beverly, I'm going to punt that same question over to you. Before any of the controversy, what was your initial thoughts when you first heard the statement, "Make America Great Again"?
So I'm kind of where Matt started out. especially when we start getting into getting closer to where people start campaigning, I just, it was not something that I connect to right out the gate. So even for me, that statement didn't become a big issue for me until the controversy came into it. I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. I wasn't watching the slogans and what was being said until the controversy came around it. You know, I heard a great description of what great really means, and I don't think that they were saying this in regards to this slogan necessarily, but that greatness is not, you don't become great by conquering. Greatness is what the character is of a person coming from the inside out and how they are affecting change for everyone around them. And so greatness is not in conquering things. Greatness is in truly bringing the character from within each one of us that produces lasting change that benefits everyone when it comes out. So yeah, so the slogan, it didn't come on my radar seriously until it became very controversial.
Okay. Thank you, Pastor Beverly. I'm gonna stay on that question and address that question continuously. But we did get a question that came in from Melvet, and her question is: do you think racism is a skin issue as opposed to a heart issue? And I think from my standpoint, it's certainly a heart issue. Unfortunately, it's a heart issue that's connected to skin color. The individuals have allowed their heart to basically judge and perceive people based off of their skin color. But certainly a heart issue. Again, when we look at the Great Command, and at least for believers, I'm really not concerned about those who, well, let me say this. I am concerned about people who are not believers, but I'm not concerned about their belief systems because we operate from a believer's perspective. And so my expectation for the church is completely different than those outside of the church. So if you're part of the church, certainly we're called to love our neighbors as ourselves, and our neighbors go beyond just people who have the same skin color as us, or people that have the same cultural preferences as us, and all of those different things. And so I think it's really important that as a believer that we understand that, yeah, our heart needs to be in the right place, and it needs to be in the place that we've been commanded to love on our neighbors as ourselves. So going back to the last question, and Willie, I'm going to punt it over to you. And that again, so the first time before any of the controversy came, the first time that you heard "Make America Great Again," what was your initial thoughts?
Basically, the way I'm looking right now, I chuckled, I laughed, because my thinking was, make America great again. How and for who? And when was it ever really great for people of color? We as African Americans, even during my lifetime, I can't think of a time when America was great for us. I don't. I mean, I agree with the speaker before that I think not necessarily right now, but before now, going into now, was probably the best America's been for African Americans. So for me, it was a joke, and I could tell by the controversy once it started how a lot of people took it to be "Make America Great Again." And the thing is that what they look at as great is not what I've ever looked at as great. Because how can America be great when you love a country that doesn't love you back? So when was it great? So yeah, I just laughed when I heard that comment, "Make America Great Again," and a lot of people are thriving, especially Caucasian people, are thriving on that because they were looking back at a time that it was truly great for them. And some of them undoubtedly, and I believe in my heart, believe that it was going to go back to that time. I don't know how they realistically believe that, but some believe that. You could even hear it in some of the controversial comments of, okay, finally we're going to get back to the way it used to be. I heard that it's going to go back to the way it used to be. No, it's not. It's not going to go back there. So yeah, I laughed at it, and I even to this day, I don't see anything great that has taken place.
All right, thanks for your perspective there, Willie. When I heard it, and I have to be honest, before any of the controversy or just when I heard it, I'm just like immediately, I'm black, and so immediately I go to the black experience, and I look back in history for black people, and I'm like, let's see, make America great again. I like, when was it ever great for black people? And I'm like, do they mean like make it great again by putting us back in slavery? Because it was pretty great for some folks with free labor. And I'm like, hopefully that's not the case. I'm praying like, please, Lord, Lord, I know I don't want to go to slavery. Like, is that where they trying to take us back? And so, initially it was it was kind of comical, but I, and I didn't know if anybody else had felt that way, like myself, but yeah, I just went back to the black experience in America and just really tried to figure out, when was it great? And I know it was probably great for different demographic of people, but from the black experience, the reality of the situation is it really wasn't that great for us. And essentially, I'm traumatized when I look at black history. And so when you start wanting to talk about trauma, and trauma is the issue that we're dealing with in the black community, I'm traumatized by black history. Is what traumatizes me. And so again, when you take me back to our history and say make it great again, it's unfortunately it's beyond comical. It's traumatizing. It's traumatizing. So Peter, I'm gonna punt that question over to you. I think Peter is back with us. Before any controversy arrived in regards to Make America Great Again, what was your initial thoughts?
Oh, it's ridiculous. It's an utterly ridiculous idea. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, and yet that was during a time when slavery existed and all men were not treated anything close to being equal. And so it's just pandering to the racist elements in the country that like to believe in this mythical America where any immigrant can come and become rich. And it's ahistorical and just plain dumb, really.
Thanks for your perspective on that, Peter. Want to move on to another question, and Pastor Beverly, I'm going to begin with you. And the question is, from your earliest years of comprehension, what was your initial thoughts regarding the date of July 4th, 1776?
Okay, I have a very clear answer on that one, but before I do, let me just dovetail on what you guys were just speaking, because I feel like this is a very big learning thing for the audience that we have. What you guys just shared about the Make America Great Again slogan, what you just shared are thoughts that never crossed my mind when I heard it. Like my view of it was that everything you guys just shared was completely off my radar. I never gave that slogan much thought. But what we need people to see, especially that are viewing, is this is why we're in the conversation. Because right now, as I'm listening to you, because I'm learning something that has never been on my radar. And these conversations are absolutely necessary so that the divide is lessened, the bridge becomes safer. And so even right now, as you guys are sitting here talking, I am learning because of my background and my perspective and where I grew up and all of my life experiences. What you guys just shared never crossed my mind. And so now I have a greater understanding of how that affects my African American brothers and sisters. And so I just wanted to give the listeners kind of a close-up view of how we've been doing life together and how it's affected us. So what you guys just shared changes my perspective of the way that that slogan was received, and it's very helpful. So anyway, so now I'll move on to answer the question that you just asked. So from my earliest years of comprehension, July 4th of 1776, that was the year for all of us in America. I grew up where the 4th of July was literally celebrated like it was Christmas. It was as big of a holiday as you could get, you know, from the time we got up in the morning to the time that we went to bed at night. It was one big long celebration and party. You know, my dad was military, retired military, and it was, you know, those were some of my greatest memories growing up, was celebrating the freedoms that we had in this country based on, you know, on what I knew and what I was experiencing as a child and have continued to experience. So that was, it was a very, very big holiday, literally right up there next to Christmas.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Beverly. Pastor Jay, I'm going to punt it over to you. From your earliest moments of comprehension, what was your initial thoughts on July 4th, 1776?
Man, 4th of July was like a major holiday. You knew as a kid, fireworks were going to be everywhere. That was the only time mom let me play with fire. You know, that was the only time I got to light stuff and throw it and watch it blow up. And what I was taught in school, though, was very different than what I was taught at home. You know, I was taught it was Independence Day for everybody. This was when America received its independence. This is something to celebrate. And I remember my mother being a real killjoy, and she was like, yeah, but independence was not for you. We celebrate it, we enjoy it for what it is. We would go out, we would go to the naval base and actually be a part of their festivities and everything. But she was like, you know, there's a reality of independence came for a lot of people, but it didn't come for us then. And, you know, so it was a bittersweet thing. I enjoyed it. I still enjoy it. We still go out. We still have a great time. I plan on teaching my daughter about it, but I also have to teach her the other side of the story, which is independence for African Americans didn't come for almost 90 more years. And that's just kind of, you know, what I was taught at a very early age.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Jay. Gonna turn it over to you, Pastor Matt, if you could give us some insight on your earliest comprehensions of July 4th, 1776.
Sure. Yeah, I think July 4th is, you know, was like, I think we're talking about the Day of Independence and lots of celebrations all day long. I think I mentioned in one of the previous ones, my grandfather served in World War II. And so they would come to our family, we'd watch parades and go to fireworks at night. So it was a day of family celebration. I don't know if I really thought that much about it the rest of the year and what that meant, to be perfectly honest. But it was a big marker of like, what's unique about our nation, what's our aspiration to be around some of these ideas of independence, equality for all. And obviously, like Jay was even saying, not in my family background, but as time went on, I began to realize, hey, there's a lot of parts of the conversation that are not really coming to the table here in equality for everybody. What does this mean? And so a lot of grappling as time went on, both, I would say, you know, in relation to Black-white issues, in relation to European colonialist and Native American populations and what that means, whose independence is this? What does it mean? At what cost? So those are questions that came later on, but growing up, it was a time of celebration, and the ideals of what America was supposed to be about this place of equality and freedom was sort of celebrated.
Thanks, Pastor Matt, for your perspective on that. Peter, I'm going to punt it over to you. Your earliest comprehension on July 4th, 1776.
So there was a parade that ran through my hometown that started a block and half away from my house. So I remember getting up early with my dad to go reserve spots to watch the parade. And then we would host a barbecue at our house afterwards. So it was fun family and friend time. But there was never anything overt in our household about, 1776 and freedom and democracy and all that. It was, from my perspective as a kid, it was just a day when my folks weren't working and we got to barbecue and hang out with friends, and they threw free candy out at the parade, and then we got to watch fireworks. So it was, not much different than any other kind of non-regular weekday that, periodically happens across the calendar.
Thanks for sharing, Peter. For me, myself, I think for me, it was just like I associated July 4th with barbecue and firecrackers. That was it. And I think in school, when it came to the point of actually comprehending what we're celebrating, because I've celebrated quite a few things and really didn't know what I was celebrating. But when the date first hit me, that it was 1776, and I'm just, the first thing that came to my mind was like, man, like how was we free? Like we were still slaves. Like, and immediately every time I see dates, for me as a black man, every time I see dates, I'm always asking like, okay, what year were we free? Like we were still slaves during that time. And so dates for me, when we go back to history as a black man, and I'm always looking back at what that meant for my ancestors at that point in time. And so you might be celebrating 200, 300 years or something. And for me, it's just like, I'm always take going back to what life was like for my ancestors at that time. So for me, I think when I finally found out what we were celebrating, freedoms, American freedom, then I realized every year when I celebrate July 4th, I'm celebrating the freedoms of my white brothers and sisters, because I mean, unfortunately, we were not free at that point in time. And so that's just kind of my comprehension of it. I have a question for Willie, just as a police officer. And I think one of the questions I would like to ask of you, and for our viewers, is, we talk a lot about police brutality and what that looks like in the black community. And then these are the times that we're also hearing, good cops versus bad cops. If you could just give us some insight on, what happens when a good cop wants to talk about what's going on and some of the wrongdoing that's happening of a bad cop. And so if you could just kind of bring us into that world a little bit.
Well, there's this thing they call the thin blue line, which is basically an unwritten rule that basically says you don't say anything. You don't say anything. That line is being diminished to a point. But when I started, that line was very, very much in place. You didn't say anything. If you speak out, then there's backlash. Now, when you look at good cop versus bad cop, and there are plenty good cops out there that are on the job, doing what they're supposed to do, doing their job, protecting their community, serving their community, the citizens in that community. They're doing what they're supposed to do. But when a bad cop does something bad and a good cop speaks up, he has something at that point to deal with. Certainly that's how it was when I was there. And if you want me to give you an example, I will. 1980, working in the jail, a white cop called a black prisoner the N-word. I complained about it. I even wrote a report on it. And to make this story short, in the end, I got punished. He got promoted. So those are some of the things that when you talk about good cop, bad cop, that the good cop who in a sense is looked at as the bad cop because he remains silent, but at the same time, he's already knowing or she's already knowing that there's a consequence for speaking up. So that's what the community doesn't see, is that cop that wants to speak up, wants to, speak against wrongdoing, but he knows that he has or she has something to face for doing it. Another example, if you look at the story that's going on in Buffalo right now, female in 2006 stopped a white officer from choking a suspect. She got fired. She lost her pension behind that. But I have so much respect for her because even today she says if she had to do it again, she'd do it all over again the same way. Because even though she lost her pension, she had 5 kids. So, you know, that was uh, quite a hardship for her and her family to deal with that. But what she says is that she still she's still breathing, and so is that person still breathing today because of her actions. Even though she was being the good cop, stopping a bad cop from doing something, and she paid quite a price for it. So that's what I would like for the community to understand is that good cops see bad things happen, and they're very apprehensive to speaking against it because of consequences they feel they're facing. So that's how it was when I was there, and I'm sure that's how it still is to a point. And some departments probably goes even deeper. I don't know. I can't speak for those, but that's what the community have to understand.
Thanks for sharing, Willie. I mean, that's a real eye-opening perspective, and it really puts me in a place. I mean, just being a part of the faith community, where, I'm just calling out, the faith community to pray for those officers that want to speak up and say something, but really have there's a dynamic where they feel the threat of being ostracized. And so just a real interesting perspective, and it just gives us in the faith community again something to be praying about in support of those officers. I have another question. I'm going to punt this over to Pastor Jay. Do you believe there's a greater challenge for an African American apologetic, that basically the defending of the gospel, and why or why not?
I believe there is. I think how the Bible has traditionally been taught, very much from a white lens and a white perspective, that as an African American, as an apologetic already, you have to try to, you're defending the scripture, you're defending the cultural context it's being taken from, you're defending what God's mind was or who the writer was. But I think as an African American, you're also trying to defend how things have been taken out of cultural context, whether that's helping, I'll give you an example, helping my white brothers and sisters understand that like there was a ton of Black people in the Bible, and the movies don't show that, the books don't show that, the picture Bibles that I grew up looking at don't show that, and people don't see that, and that becomes ingrained of maybe this is just how it was, maybe this is just what it looked like. So it's almost having to deconstruct this idea of the Bible and re-educate. And now that we've done that, which who knows how long that might take, now I can actually start defending the scripture from where it really comes from. Just as an example, so there is a sect of Christians who believe Black people have been cursed through Noah's son Canaan. That is a belief of some people. Hey, what happened with Canaan? He was cursed, to always basically work for his brothers. He ended up in Africa, but the reality is they all came from Africa, and it's like they are probably all my color or darker. But that's been a common belief. So when you start actually going into the realities of where they lived, where they grew up, where a lot of this stuff operated and happened, you're actually having to re-educate people on, hey, Canaan wasn't the only Black one in the group. There was all of them were Black. And the other two did pretty well for themselves. So it's having those conversations, people who've seen Ben-Hur or the 10 Commandments, or the movies that are coming out recently like Exodus, or some of these other ones where it's been whitewashed and it doesn't give a true perspective. So I feel like an African American apologetic is actually having to fight both conversations to come to a reasonable conclusion. Just my opinion.
Thanks for that perspective, Jay. That was really helpful. Pastor Matt, I'm going to pose that same question to you. Do you believe there's a greater challenge for African American apologetic? And if so, why or why not?
Man, I feel maybe not positioned best to answer the question, Kurt, but I'm going to take a swing at it anyway. I think what Jay just said is really helpful, you know, and with our school that we have here, Eastbrook Academy, K4 through 12th grade school, trying to bring together folks from a lot of different backgrounds into one place. I mean, part of what Jay's even talked about is part of what I've tried to do for myself and for others to kind of reread the Bible again with sort of non-white, non-Western eyes, to look back at the history of the church and realize that some of the greatest theologians that we don't really think about it this way, but like a Tertullian who came up with a framework for the Trinity, he's from North Africa. He's an African. St. Augustine, great thinker, one of the greatest philosophers, not just in Christianity, but in the history of philosophy. He's from Algeria. He's a North African. He's an African believer. And giving some of this framework and then tracing that down into sub-Saharan Africa as well. I mean, I think it, as well as the history of what we see in Scripture, it's pretty powerful when you begin to see that. I mean, so I think there's a challenge of that. It's, I think, incumbent. Maybe I'm kind of adding to the question in a different way. I mean, I think it's incumbent upon white Christians to realize sort of the, you know, the lenses that we're using to read Scripture, and to come alongside and reread Scripture and reread church history through the eyes of those who don't look like us or don't have that majority culture perspective. And we probably will begin to see things about the Bible, see things about the history of the church that we just assumed or took for granted or didn't really understand what was really going on. And if I can highlight one resource, like I'm always a book guy, you guys know this probably, the Declaration, but there's a African-American theologian, Esau McCulley, who has a book coming out in September called Reading While Black: African-American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. And if there's a theologian who's really trying to speak to some of these issues right now, Esau McCulley is one of those. And I think that book may touch on part of what you're getting at with the question as well, Kurt. So yeah, I just want to come as a learner.
Thanks, Matt, for your perspective there. Very helpful. Dr. Peter Borg, I'm going to ask that same question to you. Do you believe there's a greater challenge for an African-American apologetic, and why or why not?
Well, there certainly is, because let's face it, what in America is not more difficult for African Americans than it is for white people? I mean, so on a very foundational level, that is true. But like Matt, I'm a real book guy, and I'm reading a book right now called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. And white people love Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And this book talks about the fact that even though he grew up wealthy, well-educated, and very Lutheran, that he didn't really come to know God until he was living in New York City for a year and dissatisfied with the all-white church he was attending, and began attending church at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, and interacted with African Americans for whom the gospel was not an intellectual exercise, but Jesus was necessary for them to wake up every morning, for them to walk out the door and go to work, for them to put food on the table. Like, Jesus was utterly crucial to them living every moment of every day. And that is what gave him the courage to go back to Nazi Germany and stand up to and give his life fighting against Hitler. And so I think that one of the reasons that this is such a challenge for so many white people is they have no relationships with anybody who's not like them. And so therefore their perspective on what the world is narrow and incomplete. But that's a really worthwhile book for people who want to read about one of their heroes, but learn some stuff about him that wasn't available in the more well-known biography by Eric Metaxas.
Thanks for sharing, Peter. Pastor Beverly, I'm going to punt that same question over to you. Do you think it's a greater challenge for an African-American apologetic, and why or why not?
I think it is a greater challenge, and actually very much what has been stated previously. You know, all of us have grown up watching the same the the same Bible stories being depicted by the same people. And a couple of years ago, I don't remember who produced these, but there was a series of biblical movies that came out, and one of them was with Samson. And Samson in that movie was played by an African American man. And I remember, for me, that was a shock to my system. Like, I remember being like, going, this is kind of strange. This feels weird. And not realizing at the time why it felt weird, but because even the way that we have written the narrative in Bible stories, and the way that we have has always been through the eyes of a white person, or through the European lens. And that is something that we still have a long way to go on, because history is not actually being portrayed well in the way that we portrayed it. So Peter, with Bonhoeffer too, I remember reading in his book, I haven't read the one that you just mentioned here, but I read the book about his life, and I remember him saying that when he became involved in the African American church in New York, that like literally he began to question whether he had ever even been saved, because he encountered a Jesus like he had never known before when he was next to his African American brothers and sisters. It changed his life, and he went back to Germany a very different person.
Thank you, Pastor Beverly. For me, as I approach that question, I think I certainly believe that there's a greater challenge for an African American apologetic, because as an African American, and you have to deal with issues that you may not have to deal with in any other community. And that's one, how the Bible was historically used to preach to slaves, to be obedient to their masters and all that stuff. And so people will point that out. Unbelievers in the community is like, oh, that's the white man's religion. And they stole us from Africa, and you got to defend against all of these different things. And so now you have all of these different sects of black religions, from the black Hebrewites to all of these different things, and they're using the same Bible, but it comes from a completely different perspective. And so and seminary, it's funny because our seminaries don't have many professors that look like me. they don't prepare us for an apologetic for Central City perspective. There's very little preparation for that. And so to consistently, not only just to defend the gospel, but now you have to defend it from the standpoint that we were stolen from Africa, and then we were given a whole nother religion that wasn't our original religion. And so you got to go through this whole process. And Matt, I'm glad that you pointed out that, Christianity can be traced back to Africa. I mean, as early as the 3rd century. And so you have to be able to walk people through that whole process. But again, just for the general public that maybe have not grown up in the church, I think we've done the gospel of a huge injustice when we have not properly cared for the gospel from the perspective of the people that we want to be able to reach. And so so that's a call again. I believe even for our seminaries to begin to start addressing that and what that looks like, and preparing people better for urban ministry. I also wanted to just throw out there that we are taking questions. So if you have any questions, any listeners out there, you have some questions that you would love for us to answer, we would love to be able to do that for you. But I also want to throw another question out there to Willie. I was just, as I was just doing some of my historical research and just looking back, I mean, even from the time that the first slaves we're coming up on Juneteenth Day now, which is the actual celebration where the last batch of slaves were free in America, going back to Galveston, Texas, which is actually happened 2.5 years later after the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was funny because in 1865, when the last batch of slaves were free, the very same year the Ku Klux Klan was founded. and they were founded specifically to be a terror to the Black community, and so they found it as an organization. And these were people who were a part of the justice system. So you had judges, you had police officers, you had lawyers. I mean, they just infiltrated the entire system. And so so my question would be, what year did they stop being a part of the justice system? And so that this a question that I just want to put out there for discussion. And so if you're out there as a listener, you could pose a question. But Willie, I'm going to punt it over to you, just simply because you've been a police officer, you've served our country, and just would love to just hear your perspective.
So you say, what year did they stop being a part of the justice system? Is that correct? Okay. To answer that question, I don't know, because I don't believe they ever stopped being a part of the justice system. I don't. I think that the Ku Klux Klan walks today amongst us from all walks of life. I truly do. And they are just as much a part today of the justice system, law enforcement, government, and everything else. Because in time, they smartened up. They said, hey, we can't walk around here, terrorizing people with these hoods on and burning these crosses in their yards and all this stuff and lynching people. We got to be smarter than that, because they're becoming smarter than that. So we gotta be smart to stay ahead of them. So what did they do? They got educated and everything, and they wear their suit and ties. And for anyone to believe for 1 second that they're not part of law enforcement or the justice system, one or two things: they're ignoring it, or they're dumb enough to believe that. I'm not. There was a story that I read a couple years ago on Yahoo News. Young man in a police department in Alabama. He was, I don't know how it was found out, but he was at a Klan rally with his robe on over his uniform. And someone reported that. So I don't know how that all came about, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that he ended up getting fired. He appealed his dismissal, and in that he said that he felt that he would have no problem performing his duties as a police officer, as well as remaining a member of the Ku Klux Klan. That is not possible. That is not possible. Because that's embedded hatred. That's what the Klan preaches. That's what they've always preached. That's what they demonstrated. And for him to say that he could be a part of law enforcement, yet also be a part of the Klan, is just senseless thinking. And for anyone to believe that, their thinking is just as senseless as his. So to say what year, I can't tell you, because I don't think it's ended. It's still there. I look at some of the sentencing that happens, sentencing disparities that happen as it relates to whites or Caucasians as opposed to people of color. And when you look at those disparaging sentencing, say a white young man gets 2 years for committing an armed robbery, and then a black man ends up getting 20 years for committing an armed robbery. How can that be equal justice? And for me, I see hatred all over it. Because when have you ever heard of a young black male getting probation for sexual assault? It doesn't happen. They're always portrayed as the monster of the community, and he has to be locked up to protect the community. But then yet a white male can get 6 months, or he can get probation, for sexual assault. So, no, the Ku Klux Klan has not exited the justice system.
Thank you for your perspective on that, Willie. And just listening to that, actually, it just, again, it brings me back to as the faith community. If we're going to see real change, that's going to happen in our society, it's really going to cause for the church to be the church, and which is one of the reasons why I really appreciate Milwaukee Declaration and having the opportunity to enter into relationships with churches of other ethnicities and other communities, because it's really going to require a unified approach. And I always say, you know, as a black man, I don't have a voice. I don't really have a voice, but my white brothers and sisters, they have a voice. They do have a voice, and I don't want anybody to take that wrong. It's just realizing that my voice is a lot less than our white brothers and sisters. And so collectively as a church, I mean, we really have something to pray about if we want to see change in our society. And we are the greatest hope, because it's not going to come from the outside. And so Dr. Peter, as a historian, I know he probably wants to get in on being able to answer that question. If the Ku Klux Klan was established in 1865 and they were within the justice system, do you have any inkling on when they stopped being a part of the justice system?
Oh, I'm sure that they are still part of the justice system, but they may go by different names now. Because to the vast majority of Americans, even white Americans, the Ku Klux Klan is an evil boogeyman kind of thing. But nowadays, people with the same beliefs just call themselves the alt-right. And so it's the same awful beliefs about white supremacy and the inhumanity or dehumanization of non-white people, but they just have a different name. And the one I'm most familiar with right now is alt-right. And if you do some simple Google searches, you're going to find some scary stuff out about them. There was particularly a story that was actually done by Charles Barkley recently that you can find online. It gets into a lot of who the alt-right are and what their visions for society, American society are, that mirror exactly what the Ku Klux Klan hopes to accomplish.
Thanks for sharing, Peter. And Pastor Matt, I'll punt that same question over to you. No, it's not the greatest question in the world, but just something for discussion.
Sure. I mean, I don't have any historical study or personal experience to be able to really draw upon to answer the question. So I'm going to pass on that one if it's okay. Like, I just don't know.
Thanks, Pastor Matt. Pastor Jay, any thoughts in regards to that question?
I don't think it's changed. I think there's good and bad in every aspect of life, every aspect of the world, every profession. And that is with people as well. There are people who absolutely have hatred, who absolutely will do terrible things to people, and they work regular jobs. They get jobs just like we do. They go to work, they work in hospitals, they work, on the garbage trucks, they work in schools, they work in the policing, they work at City Hall. There's a story that I think just came out yesterday of a judge actually that got arrested 28 years. Well, he got arrested and he's been given 28 years for basically selling juveniles to the juvenile detention center. He was getting kickbacks for prosecuting juveniles and sending them to these specific juvenile detention centers. Things like that are happening. This is a judge. This is someone who has the authority to bang a gavel and to send you away from your family, to make decisions and choices based on what's going to happen to you. And, I agree with the statement I heard earlier. The difference in the sentencing laws is amazing of how they're utilized. All I'm saying is when I'm looking at equality, if me and Beverly go rob a bank up the street, we should get the same amount of time. Like that's equality. If she drove and I had the gun, or if I drove and she had the gun, we both need if it's 25 years, we both should get 25 years. It should not be where she's given an ankle bracelet and allowed to do 600 hours of community service, and I'm given 20 years, without parole for the same crime in the same city at the same place. But because we look different, our sentencing is different, and that's been proven. That has been proven that is what's happening in our system. So I absolutely do believe that it's still there. I think the alt-right, Ku Klux Klan, whatever we want to call it, that's still operational. That's still happening. For those of you that maybe know of the activist right now, Frank Nitti, who is, for all I know, downtown marching right now. He's been marching every day since this stuff jumped off here in Milwaukee. He had an alt-right threat on his life that came to notice, and the authorities notified him, hey, there's a credible threat. There's an alt-right group that's actually looking to assassinate you. He's leading peaceful protests. It's still happening. It's still real. And if you think it's going away, open your eyes. You can literally get on the news right now and see any of a number of things, whether that was Virginia a year and a half ago in the march about we won't be replaced and all these other things. All those people didn't have on masks. They didn't have on a white hood, but I guarantee you they went to work the next day.
Thanks, Jay, for sharing. Yeah, these are actually some actual scary conversations. And I think for me, I would just say, if it's one thing if this is the world's perspective, and whether it's supremacy or whatever that may look like, it's one thing if it's the world's perspective, but if this is the perspective of what's coming into the faith community, I think again that's where we speak up and stand for the gospel. Just essentially just breaks all of those divides down and breaks all of that hatred down. And I know we're coming up to close to the end of our time together. So what I would like to do is just kind of go around with all of you guys, and if there's any final thoughts that you want to leave our listeners today, and Pastor Matt, I'll start with you. If there's any final thoughts you would want to leave our listeners today, what would that be?
Yeah, this is a moment in our nation that we can't miss out on, and the church has to step forward. The church has to be engaged. We need to be learning and listening. And I, again, just take the opportunity to speak, especially to my white brothers and sisters, that we need to step forward. And again, a defining passage for me is Galatians 6:2 of bearing one another's burdens and thereby fulfilling the law of Christ. Like that means we enter into this burden of racial injustice. It means that we learn and listen, and we are willing to come alongside others who may not look like us, whose situation we may not even totally understand, and to take a position of humility, to take almost a one down position to learn and to grow. And that's part of what we're trying to do here with these conversations is listen, learn, understand each other. And if we do not do that, I think it directly affects the witness of the church and will be completely irrelevant. And we're not doing this for relevancy, but I think that will be a byproduct of the church not stepping forward into this moment to engage and to stand forth for the kingdom life, that the good life is available in God, and the church can be a different kind of community. But we won't be that kind of community if we don't step forward here.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Matt. Pastor Beverly, if there's any final thoughts that you would want to provide our listeners today, what would that be?
A thought that goes right along with the scripture that Matt just shared. And this is something that has hit me more recently, as this is just a continual growing process for me. And this also it addresses more the Caucasian church and the Caucasian believers. For a long time, I feel like we've avoided the conversation, and we have deflected, and we have told people how they should think and feel about the history of this nation and slavery, what's going on right now. That was 200 years ago, that was 400 years ago. Why do we have to go back there? It's not as bad as you really think it is. These are just things that, over the years I've heard. I've probably thought them myself. Well, I know I've thought them myself. Again, I'm on this growing journey. But this is what's really confronted me recently. When, as the body of Christ, do we get to tell someone what their wounds should look like, how those wounds came to be? As a body of Christ, we are instructed to bear one another's burdens and to tend to each other's wounds. And, kind of in a very graphic way, an analogy is, if a rape victim comes to me and tells me that they were raped 30 years ago, and they're hurting, do I tell them, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't responsible for that wound, so I really can't help you with this? That would be absolutely ludicrous. And yet that's what I see us doing as a church, going, I'm not really responsible for that. I'm not racist. I haven't done anything to inflict these wounds on you, so therefore I really don't want to enter into this. That is as anti-biblical as we can be. If there's a wound, we are responsible for tending to those wounds. And if we don't step into this, not only will we not be relevant, the church will not succeed. I believe that God is bringing this to the surface, not only to expose it but to heal it. And so if we're unwilling to go there, I wouldn't want to see where the church will wind up, because this is absolutely unavoidable, and it's completely necessary.
Thank you, Pastor Beverly. Pastor Jay, if you have any final thoughts that you would want to leave our listeners, what would that be?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, number one, for tuning in and spending this time with us. I think we're trying to have these conversations out in the open because we're hoping to encourage more conversations to happen after we leave off. I hope that what we've talked about, because we have these conversations, and I love every last person on this call. We have these talks, we share, we come at each other with things, we ask questions, and we're trying to be better people. So I think if there's things that we've said on here that have touched a nerve, really explore that. Why did that offend you? Why did that make you feel the way you felt? Ask that question. And maybe there's other things that you say, like Beverly said earlier, like, I didn't know that, I didn't realize it, or I didn't look at it that way. What we're asking is take that to other people that may be in your circle, because maybe they haven't as well. There's going to be places we'll never get into. We'll never be able to have that audience, but you can and you will. So to be able to share these things, have the tough conversations, don't back away from them. I think the time for sugarcoating and having the cover over our eyes is gone away. And I agree so much with Willie Lee down here that it's not going back. It's out of the bag now. So we're going to have to deal with it. And I think these type of conversations, we're trying to model how those conversations can be had. So please know, we love you all. We want to see the best for everybody, but we want to see it done equally. And equality is not something that anybody has a monopoly on. That's something that under the law, everybody should receive a piece of.
Thanks, Jay. Appreciate that. And we're going to punt it over to Dr. Peter. If you can give us any last final thoughts that you would want our listeners to hear, what would that be?
I would really just like to encourage people on our conversations over these last few weeks on Facebook. People are all saying you should read books, you should watch movies, and you should, learn about the problems in America and the incomplete history that you didn't know. I think that's great. But what I would really like to encourage the white listeners is don't just become friends with people who don't look like you, but actively decide where nobody looks like you. Go to a Walmart where there aren't going to be very many white people there, and do your shopping there. When it's time for your family to go out to eat, find a restaurant that in a part of town that you don't usually go into. The food's going to be delicious, I guarantee it, but it's important for you to recognize what it feels like to look around and see no one who looks like you, because that is what often happens for non-white people in this country. And then after you do the Walmart and the restaurant, then think about, a soccer league or a little league for your kids, or think about a summer camp, or which YMCA you're going to join, or whatever it is. But you will have a lot of blind spots pulled off if you actively put yourself in positions, in places rather, where nobody looks like you. I think it will help build empathy in you in a way that is God honoring.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing. Willie Lee, I'm going to pose that same question to you. If you had some final thoughts to provide to our listeners, what would that be? I think we got a couple minutes here. And so I'm going to punt that question over to you.
Okay, I'm going to try to be brief. Um, First of all, let me say thank you for having me, you know, and allow me to get a chance to speak my perspective on some of the things that are going on. Hope it made a difference. Um, but one thing I want the community to understand is that, or should I say, ask them to do, is not condemn uh, the police department, not to condemn the officers that are out there, doing their job and serving the community and citizens of their community, because just as we as a people, we don't want to be condemned, especially when we know we're doing the right thing. So, what some of the things we've talked about are topics that people get uncomfortable talking about. I'm sure there's someone that's bothered or got uncomfortable or maybe even got offended, as Jay said, about some of the things that we discussed. Uh, and like he also said, if that happened, uh, look at yourself, look into your mind, your thoughts, and say, why did I get offended? And work on that, you know. Um, we cannot remain silent. Silence has been something that's gone on too long. If the things that are going on in this country right now, and even in this city, didn't open people's eyes, I don't know when they're going to be open. Because at some point, regardless of color of skin, nationality, ethnic group, or anything else, we're going to have to come together, sit down and at the table and have a discussion to ever come to a positive solution to things that are going on. You can't, we're never going to accomplish that without coming together and discussing it. You got people running off doing their own thing, and that, if that's how they feel, that's how they feel. But at some point, we will have to come together, discuss it, and come to a peaceful solution. If you're not willing to do that, then you're part of the problem.
Thanks for sharing, Willie. I want to thank all of our panelists that's been with us this afternoon. And I just kind of want to echo Jay and what he says is, we're trying to model these conversations so you can begin to have these conversations, whether they're in your home or whether they're at your church or whether they're at your organization. And I think one of the things that we want to do is like our at the Milwaukee Declaration, we have relationships across racial lines and we really love one another. We have the opportunity to do life together. And again, we're able to have these conversations and we're able to speak from the heart. We don't hold anything back because that's how we learn from one another. And I really appreciate that I have the ears of my brothers and sisters, that they actually hear my perspective and what I'm going through. And so you may have heard something today that may have been tough to hear, may have been offensive. And again, if you're a believer, I'm going to ask that, yes, you will check your heart on that. And again, to begin to just start looking at that dynamic and how the gospel has called us to bear one another's burdens. And so we have that responsibility. Again, we can't control how the world believes, but as the faith community, we're going to hold the faith community to a higher standard, and that higher standard is in Jesus Christ. And so, so again, we just hope that you had an opportunity to engage, that you've learned some things here that you can take back to your community and begin to start having some of those conversations. We invite you to like Milwaukee Declarations page. If you have not, you can visit our website. There's some blogs there. There's some resources that's available to help you continue the conversation. And again, we would love to help be a part of that conversation and leading that forward. And so again, thank you for joining us. I want to thank Pastor Matt from Eastbrook Church that was with us today, Pastor Jay from Park Lawn Assembly who was with us today, Pastor Beverly from World Impact Church, Dr. Dr. Peter Borg from City Brook Church, and Willie Lee, who's former police officer and serviceman of the United States of America. Again, thank you all, and until next time, God bless you all.